One of the largest reform movements that came out of these ideas of the Second Great Awakening was women's rights, right? And it started within the 1800s and would continue into the mid 1900s until finally women's suffrage was granted. So it's going to be a long road ahead for these women who started to come together in the 1800s. Now, some of our first advocates of women's rights were actually abolitionists. Um, and that's because a lot of the abolitionists, especially those former slaves and women, kind of saw a lot of themselves in each other. They both were not really considered citizens. They didn't have the right to vote. They were both considered property in a sense. So they kind of saw things eye to eye and had the same experiences. So it was very common to see a lot of your abolitionists also being supporters of women's rights. Women at this time, right, they had no vote. There was no equal pay for the work that they did. They weren't usually educated. It was rare to have a woman to be able to go to school, and there was not a lot of schools and colleges in particular who allowed women. Money always belonged to either the husband or the father if they were unmarried, and usually they were also kind of viewed as property, and whatever the husband or father decided for the family, that's usually what went. And women really had no individual rights, didn't really have a way of owning their own property or having their own independent life either. So it was very kind of mirroring the life of what it was like to be a slave at times, or even considering to be more like a small child, because they weren't really viewed as their own independent adults. One of the biggest proponents of women's rights and starting this women's rights movement was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She actually tried to attend an abolitionist rally with her husband. They were both abolitionists. They had gone to London for the World Anti-Slavery Rally, and when she arrived, she wasn't allowed to go in because she was a woman, right? And this is what really started this idea of women's rights for Stanton. She met up with Lucretia Mott, who became one of her best friends, and she and Lucretia both created the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And this was the Seneca Falls Convention. That for the first time, women gathered together, and men as well, those who all viewed women's rights as important right in this convention, and began to talk about what needed to be done and all of the injustices that were happening throughout the world. And they created what was known as the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions, which was kind of taking the idea of the Declaration of Independence and everything that was said in the Declaration of Independence and applying it to women as well, and kind of laying out all of the injustices that was occurring because of gender relations, in particular here in the United States. When we think about the early women's movement, there were two pillars or two ideas that were part of the women's movement. One was abolitionism, the other was temperance. And that's because these two things were ideas that women could definitely relate to. Abolitionism, like we said, there was a very a lot of similarities between women and slaves in the sense that they had no votes and they had no rights and they weren't really viewed as citizens. And the temperance movement, because of the fact that a lot of the issues that stemmed from alcohol, right? The biggest people who were affected by alcohol were usually men. And if they were abusive of alcohol and that became an illness and they became drunk, the ones who suffered from this alcoholism were usually at home and usually women. And the way that they suffered was the fact that it wasn't uncommon for men who were alcoholics to end up beating their families. And so their wives became victims of these things. So that's why these two issues became particularly important for women's rights in the whole women's rights movement. Other leaders within women's rights movements as it developed, Lucy Stone was also an abolitionist. She was a suffragist, which is what we refer to as those women who wanted to get the vote for women, right? Suffrage voting, and was an advocate and an organizer to promote women's rights. She became the first woman in Massachusetts to earn a college degree. Susan B. Anthony is always a very well-known suffragette, and in particular for women's rights. She really is responsible for making the idea of women's rights and this movement really become a political movement, and she did a lot for actually organizing it and making it very influential. She encouraged New York to try and pass laws to allow women to own their own property, and she was really a big leader in moving this movement forward and making it a very important movement. And that's why when the idea of suffrage for movement for suffrage for women happened here in the United States, and it finally became an amendment granting votes to women, it was known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Right, because she really did a lot for making this a very big political issue for women as the movement grew.